The terminal at gate B6 pulsed with energy, rolling luggage, fast footsteps, overhead announcements blending with the soft ding of departure boards. Families clutched tickets, business people clung to laptops, and earbuds dulled the noise of the world. In the middle of the chaos sat a man no one noticed. Edward Ed Mallory, 85 years old, occupied a single black chair near the large window facing the tarmac. He wore an old olive-green bomber jacket, its seams frayed at the cuffs, and a khaki cap in his lap bearing the faded emblem of the 101st Airborne. His posture was straight, but his shoulders had softened with age. A wooden cane rested against his knee, and beside him a canvas duffel bag, simple, old, and worn like him. His face was weathered, his skin pale with deep lines carved by both sun and time, but his eyes, steel blue and steady, watched the planes outside with quiet focus. He wasn't checking departure times or scanning his phone. He wasn't waiting on anyone. He just sat, still and alone. Travelers walked past him without a second glance. One teenager accidentally brushed his cane and mumbled a quick, "Sorry, sir," before moving on. A mother steered her child away when the little girl curiously pointed and asked, "Mommy, why is that grandpa sitting there so long?" "Don't stare, sweetie," the mother replied, pulling her closer. Ed didn't react. He was used to being invisible. He reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a yellowed letter, creased in all the right places. He didn't read it. He only held it for a moment before placing it back gently, along with a folded brochure. Annual Airborne Veterans Remembrance Ceremony, Arlington. His fingers lingered on the cover. Every year, he told himself, he wouldn't go. Every year, he went anyway. Not for attention, not for medals, just to remember. He hadn't told anyone, not his niece who lived 2 towns over, not the friendly neighbor who always brought his newspaper inside. He'd booked the flight alone, packed light, and made his way to the airport like it was any other errand. As the boarding gate number flashed on the screen and another announcement played, Ed adjusted his jacket and sighed. The air around him was filled with anticipation, vacations, business trips, reunions. But for Ed Mallory, the journey wasn't about the destination. It was about the memory of those who never got to come home. And at gate B6, among hundreds of travelers, one old soldier quietly waited for his flight, not for recognition, but for remembrance. The minutes ticked by, but the world around Ed Mallory didn't slow down. Boarding calls echoed through the speakers. Passengers hustled to find chargers, grab snacks, or switch gates. A child spilled juice near the vending machine. A businessman barked into his phone about a missed connection. No one looked at the quiet man in the olive jacket sitting perfectly still by the window. He might as well have been a piece of furniture. Ed didn't mind. He'd long since learned that being invisible wasn't the worst thing. In fact, it often came with peace. Still, there were moments, even now, that cut deeper than he admitted. Like when a gate agent politely asked if he was waiting for someone, and upon hearing he was traveling alone, offered a thin smile before walking off. Or when a teenage boy loudly wondered, Why's that guy wearing an army jacket? Is that even real? His friend just laughed, oblivious. Ed looked down at the faded 101st Airborne patch stitched into his chest pocket. It was real. More real than most people in this terminal would ever understand. He shifted in his seat, knees stiff. With effort, he reached into his duffel bag and pulled out a small photo, the same one he always carried. 4 young men, arms around each other, standing in dirt and dust, rifles slung over their backs, grinning like boys. The edges of the picture had curled, and the ink was fading. But the memory hadn't. 3 of the men in the photo never made it home. Ed was the 4th. He closed his eyes briefly, as if trying to remember the sound of their laughter over the roar of helicopters. Then, as if grounded by ritual, he opened a second item, an invitation. Honoring the fallen of Echo Company, Memorial Ceremony, Arlington National Cemetery. He had attended every year for 37 years, not to be seen, not to speak, just to show up for the ones who couldn't. But this year felt different, harder. The walk had been slower, the airport louder, his body more tired. He wasn't sure he'd come again. Still, he showed up, because showing up was what soldiers do. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir. Are you cold? Would you like to move closer to the heater?" Ed opened his eyes to see a young airport janitor, no older than 20, standing beside him with concern in his eyes. "No, son," Ed said gently. "Just waiting. Not for heat." The janitor nodded, clearly unsure what to say next. Then his eyes dropped to the patch on Ed's jacket. His brow furrowed. Recognition flickered. "Were you in the army, sir?" Ed smiled slightly. "A long time ago." The janitor nodded slowly, quietly. "Thank you for your service." He didn't say it loudly. He didn't say it for attention. He just said it like he meant it. Then, without another word, the young man turned and walked away. Ed watched him disappear into the crowd, and for the first time that morning, he wasn't entirely alone. The boarding area at Gate B6 began to fill with the usual energy of an approaching flight. Families lined up near the gate agent. Pre-boarding announcements echoed overhead. Passengers fumbled with tickets, backpacks, and coffee cups. Ed Mallory sat quietly through it all, as he always had, until someone returned. The young janitor from earlier, his name tag read Tyrese, approached again, this time with a security officer at his side. Ed blinked, slightly concerned, but remained calm. "Sir," the officer said gently, kneeling beside him, "would you mind if I asked, were you part of the 101st Airborne?" Ed gave a small nod. "I was." The officer's expression changed. "My grandfather served in that unit. He talked about it, right up until the end." He stood up and stepped back. Then, unexpectedly, he saluted. It was crisp, proper, more military than airport. Ed's face tightened, not with offense, but with the weight of memories. He nodded respectfully in return. And someone saw it. A woman nearby, a mother with 2 children, paused mid-scroll on her phone, watching the exchange. She lowered her device and whispered something to her daughter, who looked up curiously. Her son, maybe 8 years old, stood up and asked loudly, "Mom, is he a real soldier?" The mother nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, he is." The boy turned to Ed and said simply, "Thank you." It began with that. Then came the ripple. A man in a business suit, who had been frustrated minutes ago about a delayed boarding, now set down his laptop bag and slowly stood. He began to clap, soft at first. Then a second person joined, then another, then 10. Within moments, the boarding area was no longer filled with shouts or frustration. It was filled with applause, applause for a man who had sat unseen just minutes before. Ed looked up, stunned. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply sat there, his cane gripped in one hand, his cap in the other, surrounded by a growing wall of sound and faces full of gratitude. The gate agent stepped out from behind the desk, walked up to him, and crouched to his level. "Mr. Mallory, if you'd allow us, we've arranged to upgrade your seat to first class. The flight crew has been informed." "I didn't ask," he started. "You didn't have to?" she interrupted softly. "You've already given enough." Ed stood slowly, knees trembling, back straight. And then, as if by instinct, he raised his hand to his temple, a crisp, slow salute. The crowd fell silent. And in that pause, something rare filled the air. Honor. Not the kind you see in headlines, the kind that whispers, lingers, and makes strangers cry without knowing why. The boy who had thanked him earlier stepped forward, holding something, a small paper flag he had drawn in red, white, and blue crayon. "Can you take this with you?" he asked. Ed reached out and took it carefully, nodding. "Yes, son, I will." As the gate opened for boarding, the airline staff gently guided him down the jet bridge. He walked slowly, turning once to look back at the crowd now watching in silence. He didn't wave. He didn't have to. They would remember this long after the plane had left the ground. The applause had faded, but the feeling lingered. Ed Mallory moved slowly down the jet bridge, assisted gently by a flight attendant who introduced herself as Claire. She didn't speak much, just offered a kind arm and a warm smile, both of which meant more to him than words ever could. When they boarded the plane, the pilot was waiting outside the cockpit. He extended his hand. "Sergeant Mallory, it's an honor. We heard you were coming." Ed hesitated, then shook the man's hand. "It was a long time ago," he said. "Not to us," the pilot replied. As he took his upgraded seat, 1A window, Ed placed the small hand-drawn paper flag from the boy into the pocket in front of him. He ran his fingers along the edges carefully, like one might with a folded letter from an old friend. The cabin filled. Passengers passed by more slowly than usual. a few offering nods, some mouthing "thank you," others simply pausing in respectful silence. He'd never been treated this way before. Not after the war, not at home, not even during the decades he quietly attended memorials alone. And yet here, in a crowded airplane bound for D.C., people somehow understood. As the wheels left the ground and the clouds swallowed the windows, Ed closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. The roar of the engines blended with memory, mud, smoke, the sound of his friend's voice calling out, the heaviness of carrying a wounded comrade on his back, the silence after it was all over. Midway through the flight, Claire returned. "I have a message from 27B, she whispered. "A woman says her father served in Korea. She asked if you'd accept this." She handed him a tiny envelope with a neatly folded note inside. "I never had the chance to thank my dad, but I can thank you." He folded the note and placed it beside the paper flag. Later, another flight attendant stopped by. "We're not supposed to do this," she said softly, "but the captain wanted me to offer you the intercom if you'd like to say anything before we land." Ed shook his head. "I've said all I needed to, just not out loud." She understood. When the plane landed at Reagan National Airport, the passengers remained seated longer than usual, not pushing to disembark. The pilot's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have the honor of carrying a man who served not only this country, but those he fought beside. Today, we don't just land, we remember. Sergeant Edward Mallory, we salute you." Everyone clapped again, but softer this time, not out of restraint, but reverence. As Ed stepped off the plane, cane in hand, he saw someone waiting near the gate. A woman in her 50s, tears already in her eyes. She walked up, held out a small photo, and whispered, "You saved my father in 1971. He told me your name. I never thought I'd find you." Ed looked at the photo. Young soldier, unmistakable face. He nodded slowly. Then, for the first time all day, he smiled. The sun had begun its slow descent over Arlington when Edward Mallory finally arrived. Dressed in his weathered jacket and carrying nothing more than his duffel and a folded paper flag drawn by a child, he stepped quietly onto the grass where names were carved into stone, row after row, as precise and disciplined as the men who once wore the uniforms. The ceremony had already begun, but Ed didn't come to be seen. He came, as always, to remember. He found the stone marked with the names of the 3 men from that old photo, his brothers in arms. He knelt slowly, painfully, and placed a single coin on each headstone. A small ritual, a private language between soldiers. Then, from inside his coat, he took out the little note handed to him on the flight. "I never had the chance to thank my dad, but I can thank you." He folded it once more and tucked it beneath a flower stem on the final grave. And last of all, he took the crayon flag from his pocket and set it upright in the soft soil. It didn't look like much, but it fluttered in the breeze like the real thing. He stood with effort. A military honor guard, young men in dress blues, had quietly stepped into formation nearby. They had seen him arrive. They knew who he was. As he turned to leave, they raised their rifles and offered a silent, respectful three-volley salute. He stopped walking, stood at attention, and returned it. No words, no cameras, just the wind in the trees and the weight of silence earned the hard way.